Good morning, everybody. Good, it's on. Good morning, everybody. Can I just get everybody's attention? Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Granger Bay. I think we've been blessed with a beautiful day, one that offers us stunning views where we can really look far. And I trust that the discussions and the talks that we are going to have here today are also going to allow us to see very far. My name is Barry, and I'll be the program director for the day. And if you had gone through the program, you'd have seen there's a stunning selection of speakers today who are going to explore various aspects of this very pressing topic, which makes me think of an old Chinese curse. It's supposedly a Chinese curse, which goes something to the effect of, "May you live in interesting times." And while it sounds like it's a polite blessing, it's actually one which is associated with huge disruption. And that is what makes this such an interesting time to be in education and to be in a space such as this. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Prof. Trike Huyswemer to share with us some words of welcome. Prof.
Thank you so much, Barry. It's indeed a pleasure for me to say a few words as part of the welcome and to set the scene sort of for today. First of all, I would like also to say welcome to our esteemed speakers for the day, which are Professor Titus, Dr. Strydom from Stellenbosch University, and Prof. Hartman from UCT, and then obviously also our own Professor Zaid Wagit, whose father I used to know many years ago when I was still young and a young academic. And then, of course, to all the other CPUT colleagues that are here. I'm very excited about the topic of today. Now, if we read it, it says, "Teaching and learning in higher education post-COVID-19, where are we going?" I find it a very relevant topic, and yet on the other hand, I was asking myself, why only now? Why only now after COVID-19 has the penny dropped finally? Is it maybe because of vice-chancellors not always being open-minded enough? Is it about academics that feel uncomfortable? They lack the confidence to take on new technologies that will actually enhance the complete student experience? Is it maybe people being afraid of AI and robots and, there are a lot of insecurities? Or is it rather a matter of not wanting to move out of their comfort zones? And I think it may be actually all of that, so to speak. So for me, I, once again, when I was fully doing what I love most, to do research before I was mad enough to go into management. I've done a lot of research then 15 years ago on the future of higher education and learning specifically, and how technologies can actually take us forward. I'm not talking about technologies only, to use the devices and it looks funky or whatever, but devices and methods that really, really enhance the student experience. I am really excited about the powerful, and I want to use the word powerful, opportunities that technology is going to give us in the next years to come, especially if we can think how we will hopefully transfer knowledge differently, have bigger impact in our classrooms, not always have to meet with our students face to face, but the ecosystem, a virtual ecosystem that we will be having around them, how that can especially also contribute towards students' academic backlogs. Now, I say that COVID has actually been a blessing. Um, and I must qualify this by saying I do acknowledge that many families lost lives and loved ones, myself included. But I was thinking, if it was not for COVID, where would we have been today? Would we still then be where we used before COVID, putting it aside, resisting change, stay in our little comfort zones? So I'm grateful that at last, COVID was for me actually the game changer, so to speak, to really transform teaching and learning pedagogies, digital and online pedagogies and andragogies. So where do we go post-COVID? And I'm really looking forward to hear what our speakers are going to say on those topics. I am, for one thing, very sure, and that is that 2 to 3 decades from now, traditional ways will be challenged as we see more technologies also coming into the higher education space. We know that universities are currently also being questioned about their relevance, about the impact they have, and I also do believe that if a university cannot play a leading role in bringing change in its immediate environment, let's say, for instance, schools, what do we do there? How do we transfer what we know and the knowledge that we have to make sure that we will have eventually also students coming to our universities with less backlogs? My understanding and conviction is really that those universities who are going to be leaders will be those universities that are agile enough to embrace technology in its fullest sense. So what are we still debating? Is it about subsidy allocations that we maybe will get less subsidy because as we move to a hybrid model, as a result of DHET and government not yet figuring it out, coming up with new ways of subsidizing universities. So we must also remember that the years to come will be difficult in the sense that it could be less government funding. How will we continue to develop and invest in our infrastructure and the maintenance thereof? What we do know is that online learning or hybrid models will be here to stay. I can't see us going back. And if we look at the statistics that talk about the e-learning market and in its different forms, the market value of that is in America, for instance, expected to raise beyond $325 billion by 2025. So for me, I think we have come a long way. We have identified the challenges such as that it's difficult, that we won't be able to provide students with the necessary academic support, and yet COVID has taught us how some of those challenges can easily be addressed. I do believe that there's absolutely still a need for face-to-face interactions, but by the use of optimizing technologies. There are, for instance, I know when we started in 2020, when we started to roll out COVID implementation strategies, one of the biggest issues was assessment. And fortunately, even that has been addressed, not completely, I won't say completely, but certainly technologies of face recognition, movement recognition, etc. So I will not touch upon many other issues, but I want to say in conclusion, the digitalization of higher education is here to stay. This field evolves every day, and I think for those of you working in the field, can never say that your research is completed because it's ongoing, and so it will be. Each year, for me, brings more opportunities to diversify and to modernize learning and teaching in our universities. My plea is that those of you who are here today will really be activists for change, for a better way of teaching and learning in higher education and for student support. I want to encourage you to be brave, to be influential, to be scholars, because you cannot be a transformative kind of academic if your work views, perspectives are not based on scholarly activities. Develop new learning theories. I think there is just so much to be researched in this new world that we are living, and keep on changing and challenging your institutions to embrace for the better technologies. We cannot afford to keep on teaching how we did 1,000 years ago. So I hope today will be the day when a day of reimagining, rethinking, re-engineering what we have been doing, and that it will bring a lot of excitement and enthusiasm into the spaces that we work in. With those few words, I want to welcome you and say maybe, and I don't know whether that might have been a good idea, but it would have been actually great if the presenters could stand outside the glass doors, and that you can have this wonderful view. But maybe it's not so practical. Prof. Wagit, congratulations on this colloquium. I don't know what you call it, but I think it's such a wonderful opportunity just to share ideas and to step out of our comfort zones. Welcome, colleagues, and have a beautiful day here in Granger Bay. Thank you.
Thank you for those words of welcome, Prof. Swemmer. I've gotten used to online meetings where we've all started with NCOI, no conflicts of interests. And I think why it took so long to start, because I wasn't making eye contact with many of the attendees. Everybody was digitally engaged. And that struck me while I was sitting there. Now, my conflict of interest is that I'm probably the resident Luddite, probably a neo-Luddite. And I'm really here to hear a discourse of hope, that the doom and gloom associated with the loss of proximity and intimacy is going to be overshone by the possibilities that's going to come from the speakers here today. So, no conflict of interest, but I am the resident Luddite. Our first speaker today is an associate professor at the School of Education at UCT. She's a Commonwealth Scholar, obtained a PhD in 2008. She currently holds the Distinguished Teachers Award at UCT for her work with students in curriculum design and implementation. She's the recipient of the Mellon Young Scientist Award for her work on child development, and has published numerous articles, reports, and book chapters in a field of research interest, developmental psychology, and cultural historical activity theory. Her research is predominantly in child development and teaching and learning, with a specific focus on the use of technology in educational and home settings. She's an NRF-rated scientist and serves as EXCO member for Africa of the International Society for Cultural Historical Activity. I'm sure there must be an acronym for that somewhere. And is research and secretary for the International Associate for Cognitive Educational and Psychology. Prof. Hardman, the floor is yours.
Wow, that's a very interesting introduction. Can't wait to meet this woman. I'll just wait for them to hook me up with this. Don't know what I'm doing. Okay. Right. So I am Joanne Hardman from UCT, and I want to thank you very much for inviting me here to Granger Bay, which is really beautiful, and particularly to Prof. Wagit. There's nothing happening here. Particularly to Prof. Wagit for inviting me. Teaching and learning with technology is something that is very interesting to me from a cognitive perspective. I'm not a teacher. I'm a psychologist, unfortunately. I don't have any teaching training, but I research in teaching and learning, and I'm fascinated by how tools can alter you cognitively. And computers are, in fact, tools. They can be tools. They can be nothing particularly useful, but they can be tools. Do I just flip up to, okay. So we're working under COVID, and we all had to go online, and I had 2 hours to go online before my lecture started with 200 people. And what I know about technology is that, slide is not active. What I know about technology is no technology is useful in and of its own. The pedagogy behind it is what is useful. So how you teach with technology is going to be whether that technology is learning, is going to lead to development or not. So what was the problem? There's 2 problems that we face. South Africa underperforms spectacularly in international benchmarking tests of maths and science particularly, but also in language. I have a problem with benchmarking tests. I think they don't measure anything to do with cognition, but the fact is we perform below anyone in Africa. So that's the one problem. We really are not competitive in the 21st century in terms of science and maths, okay? Second problem is COVID. We now have this technology, but how do you teach with technology? Now, I've made the distinction in a paper between teaching with technology and teaching through technology. When you teach with technology, you have the technology with you, and you say, okay, now go and press on that button, and we're going to go to that website, and we're going to do this, okay? When you teach through technology, you don't have to be there. What does that mean? It means the technology has to be so sophisticated that it can teach the child developmentally. I talk about children because I work with children, but I also work with postgraduates. So I started fiddling with a model. Now, as the nice gentleman who introduced me said, I do work in cultural historical theory. I find it very useful. It situates human cognition in context. If you know anything about neuroscience, you know that we develop both environmentally and genetically, okay? You can't separate the environment from the genes from the minute the child is born. And, you know, even something like IQ is not static, and it's certainly not inherited, and it certainly is able to change if you teach children properly, okay? So if you want to change your IQ, you can come speak to me. I can do it in 2 minutes. I've got a little thing that I can do for you. Okay, so cultural historical theory is best known in the work of Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist. He was many things, but one of the things he was a psychologist. And he basically said that for learning to happen, there has to be mediation in a particular environment. Mediation is the guidance of a more skilled expert, and that guides the child into a way of knowing. Mediation isn't scaffolding. Scaffolding is an Americanization from Wood, Bruner, and Ross, got nothing to do with Vygotsky and nothing to do with mediation, okay? Mediation happens in this unique space called the zone of proximal development, which is a social space that opens between you, the teacher, the more expert, and the novice. How do you do that in a computer if you're not there? How would you do that? In fact, how would you do that in a class even? How do you open up a space for someone to begin to learn? So I've been thinking about this for 3 years now, because I'm not satisfied with the models that underpin teaching with technology. TPAC and SAMR are not learning theories. They're not even theories. They're instructional models, okay? So there isn't actually a theory that underpins technology use except constructivism, which is used really poorly by everyone who uses it, and no one seems to have a particular knowledge of what it is. So if you're going to instruct someone, what must you do? What are the things that must happen for someone to learn? I'm not talking about someone to remember. I'm talking about them to go from not knowing to knowing, okay? That uncomfortable feeling. It's not comfortable to learn, okay? You must establish distance between that person, the student, and the problem. If the student approaches the problem with their everyday knowledge, their contextual knowledge, they will solve it with their contextual knowledge. In other words, they'll solve it based on their experience. Why does the sun rise? It's filled with helium. A child told me once, it's filled with helium, that's why it rises. Well, why not? Balloons rise when they're filled with helium. Sounds perfectly natural to me. So you need to establish this distance. So online, also face-to-face. You need to teach them to argue logically, and to argue logically requires that they use evidence, scientific evidence, not evidence my granny told me if I eat a lot of carrots, I will see in the dark. It is true that carrots contain carotene. In order to see in the dark by eating carrots, you will have to eat so many carrots that you go orange, okay? So Granny's right, there's a grain of truth, but you're gonna look orange, okay? Donald Trump, maybe that's his, he eats carrots, right? They must provide evidence. They must follow the rules for arriving at an answer. And here's something that we don't do as academics. We don't tell them or ask them, how did you arrive at this answer? What steps did you use to arrive at this answer? And how do you know that this answer is right? What makes it count as a valid answer? No answer is valid in the absence of evidence. Where's your evidence? Okay? I'm great fun at dinner parties, trust me. People come with all their theories and this and this and this. Where's the evidence? Show me. I want hard evidence. Okay. So these things are not even traditionally done in a lecture hall. How are we going to do them online? Well, let's first start in the lecture hall. Okay. So what's the first thing I do? See this lovely little picture here? I give that to my students. Okay, this is a conceptual picture that I mocked up. And I say to them, you got 90 seconds. Look at the picture, you got 90 seconds. Then I take the picture away and I ask them to draw it. How would you draw that picture? What would you, what things in your brain are you going to use to draw that picture? People will say, oh, I remember it. Can't. Your memory can only hold between 5 and 7 things at a time in it, okay? You can't remember that. None of you humans can remember that, okay? So you have to do something else. What is it? What do you think it is? Resemblance? Resemblance to what? You're very right. It looks like a house. Now that's the first way to do it, okay? The first way is to use your everyday knowledge and say, it looks like a house. Not only does it look like a house, but there are other things I recognize. The Christian cross. Many of us may not be Christian, but that symbol is well known. Whether it means to us a Christian cross or something different, that is a known symbol. So yes, resemblance, that is a fantastic way to remember without having to use your memory. You're using a different part of your brain, okay? There's another thing we do, shape. We know what shapes are. Now remember, shapes are abstract concepts, eh? They don't exist. A triangle has absolutely no existence in the world outside of our agreement that that thing is a triangle. It's completely abstract, okay? Just like the word DOG. No existence in the world outside of our agreement that DOG is dog. There's nothing in the word DOG that has a tail, 4 legs, nothing to... It's totally abstract. Knowledge in school, knowledge at university is completely abstract, okay? Another thing you might use to solve this is number. Again, something completely abstract. You would have had to be taught these things in order to solve this problem. Now, when students face this problem, they can't solve it on their own with their everyday knowledge alone, okay? They need to step away from the problem and draw on higher cognitive skills to solve the problem. So what have we got going on there? We've got distance between themselves and the task, okay? So already they're feeling a bit like, whoa, this woman's mad. What the hell is going on here? Are we going to have shapes? Or am I going to have to keep every 90 seconds drawing something? I don't want to be here anymore, okay? So this is the model I've come up with. I call it the teach, assess, teach model, okay? You teach to the students, then you assess them, and then you teach again, rather than the normal, which is teach, assess, teach, what's it, teach, and then assess, okay? Usually what we do is we use assessment as the end point, right? So we say, oh, this is marvelous, you're an 80%er. What is that? What is an 80%er? And how is an 80%er different to a 40%er? Oh, you're going to say to me, one is cleverer. Really? What if I told you that, for example, socioeconomic status predicts how well you do on a test? If you have high socioeconomic status, you will do well on a test, and if you have low socioeconomic status, you will do poorly on a test. Are we then saying people who are poor are stupid because they get 40%? You see, your argument becomes a bit wobbly there. If you think you're an 80%er because you got 80%, it means nothing. It shows a minute in time. All it shows you is that minute in time, what that person could remember and put on the test. And what did I just tell you? How good is memory? Not great. Not great, okay? So when we set tests as an end point, we're not teaching. I don't know what we're doing. So for me, I assess, and then I teach. I take the assessment, and I look, and I say, oh, okay, they don't understand accommodation. I teach Piaget for my sins, I suppose. I don't know. Have you read him? Oof. I think it must be the translation. It's pretty bad. I then assess them. I see where they don't know, and then I teach to what they don't know. Okay, so for me, assessment isn't this high stakes, all or nothing matric. I mean, my colleagues here, very nice ladies at this table here who welcomed me so well from the business school or wherever, they say matric is being written in about 2 weeks, okay? And everyone's like, oh, matric. And what is the matric going to show? That someone got 80 and someone got 40. And then you're going to come to me and you're going to tell me the person with 40 shouldn't come to university because they're stupid. And then I'm going to say, well, will you go and look where they live, please? And who's educated in their family and what their situation is. Okay, it's a perpetuation. Assessment is a perpetuation of an unequal system, a high-stakes assessment. That's my opinion. You can talk to me afterwards. So what does my model say? My model says the first thing you have to do is you have to create cognitive dissonance or cognitive conflict. When we talk about motivation, it's not like, oh, I'm so motivated, I'm going to the gym today. That's not what motivation is in learning. Motivation is terror in learning, okay? Think about it. I remember doing my PhD and my supervisor said something to me. I don't know what she was talking about. And she said, yeah, and just go and draw it. And I thought, oh, God, I can't draw, first of all. I don't know what you're talking about, second of all. And that feeling of utter panic motivated me to take 7 books out of the library, sit down on the floor and try and find out what the hell she was talking about. That is motivation. It's cognitive dissonance. I don't know what you're doing. I need assistance to help me. The assistance might be a book. It might be a computer. It might be another person, okay? That's the first thing you need to do. When you've created that dissonance, that distance from their comfort zone, then you can teach them the concepts you want to teach them, the abstractions, okay? Linking it to what they already know. Then you test them to see what they have acquired. If they haven't acquired anything, you teach again, okay? So this is the model that I use with my students. And I tried it face-to-face, and I'm going to try it online. And I'll tell you about that. So this study I did, and this paper is in review, so when it comes out, I will send it to you and you can distribute it, obviously if the kids accept it. Yeah. We all know what that's like, don't we? So I asked myself, what does pedagogy that leads to cognitive change look like? Okay, I'm not interested in people regurgitating what I've told them. I'm interested in them taking the knowledge and changing the world, okay? And I mean even children. I'm not interested in the fact that you can write a definition for photosynthesis. Go grow me a bloody potato, okay? Then I know that you know what you're doing, okay? And what do students think of this? And then I wanted to know, how have they changed cognitively? Now, Neil Mercer at the SLANT project in Cambridge has come up with this notion of exploratory talk. And he's got a lot of research, I think 8 or 10 years of research, showing that exploratory talk is evidence of critical reasoning. So I wanted to see, in this class, if I use this model, does this happen? So honors students, our favorite guinea pigs, so there were 48 of them, around 36 years old, 30 primary and secondary. I did 6 hours of video. The analysis is qualitative and quantitative, so not the method, but the analysis. So I analyzed the talk, looking for exploratory talk, in a quantitative way, using in vivo, but the qualitative way was exit slips. So, first of all, what do students think about this pedagogy? Well, they were very, very nice about it, okay? They said it's very different, it makes content more accessible, it was more interactive. We know that learning is better when it is more interactive. The module incorporates a great deal of discussion in the lecture theatre. We get to hear each other's ideas. Again, interaction. Everything about this teaching spoke to my need to studying education. It was brilliant. I should get a badge and wear that, actually. So they also said it was more accessible. I didn't understand Piaget. Now I do. That figure, the conceptual figure, I found very powerful. We don't ever get taught to externalize what we are thinking. Even we don't get taught. How many of you, when you stand up and give them an essay, say to them, how do you get 75% and above on an essay? Because there's a way. Define, describe, illustrate, and link. If you do those 4 things, you can never fail an essay in the academy. How many of you tell your students that? Because you know it. You may not know you know it, but you know it, okay? Externalizing what we know is really difficult. Exploratory talk. 57% of their talk, which was 33%, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, stage, 57% of their talk was exploratory talk. 57% of their talk was indicative of the kind of talk that Neil Mercer says indicates critical reasoning, thinking, not regurgitating, not reinforcing, not remembering, critical thinking. Wow, okay. This is just a case study. I can't go wild about it. But I did go a little bit wild about it, okay? So I cast my net out wide for funding because I thought, if this works face-to-face, I wonder if I can design an app with this model in it that can be used to teach science. I got 1 minute. We've designed the app, okay? I'm in the moment doing a paper on it. It's teaching science to grade 5s. We have an online world with avatars, problems, cognitive conflict, assessment, all of it built into it. It's terrifyingly exciting. The designers, these brilliant people like this lady in the white shirt, the designers are busy making it for me because I can't make avatars. And next year we'll roll it out. So next year, let's meet again and find out if this model that works face-to-face can work with children, i.e. teaching through technology, not with technology. The technology has been designed in such a way that it teaches the child. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Please stay there. Can you stay at the podium? Thank you, Prof. Hardman. May I ask, are there any questions? I've got the roaming mic here, which I could then take to whoever would like to pose a question. We have one over there.
I don't know. I've just been put in this now. I'm Zaybun Ahmed. I'm in the science education at CPUT. So it just struck me now because you made this, this example of the app. And I'm just wondering, so maybe this is what we're going to hear from you next year when you introduce the app to the whole wide world. Where's the teacher going to be in this? And that is what my interest is. And we were talking about it this morning with our Barry also. And maybe, Barry, this discussion we will take further. But I'm just thinking.
Where's the teacher?
Where's the teacher in all this? And with your app also.
Now, there's no physical teacher. There's a mushroom. And the mushroom is programmed with AI. So the world is a fynbos biome. Okay, unique fynbos biome. They're grade 5s and they're faced with problems. One of the problems is pollution in a river. And they find out that there's pollution in the river because the fish are floating on top of the river, okay? So they've got all these things like magnifying glasses and zoom goggles, like microscopes, and they can go and they've got to do a scientific inquiry. They can ask the mushroom if they get caught out, okay? But the mushroom is obviously programmed with a certain amount of AI. Not good enough for me, okay? So behind the mushroom is access to a real live person where you drop your questions and they will then be answered. And that real live person is actually has a PhD in biology, but she's also a science teacher and is interested in it. You see, my interest really is to find out what if there isn't an actual teacher, but the teacher, you, the genius scientist, is designing these apps. So you are there, but you're just not there. You're there in the way it's made. It's very bizarre. It sounds like something out of, I don't know, you know, the Robot Wars or something. But think about it. You have all that knowledge. You can make a world. We have the technology to make a world where every single different thing that you can anticipate can be programmed. And for grade 5, it's very easy, let's face it.
We've got 2 more questions, one at the back there.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this interesting presentation. Actually, I'm Mohammed from Civil Engineering Department at CPUT. The model that presented here is TAT, T-A-T. But in my understanding is that in engineering subjects, because students mostly they have to spend too much time on practicals and solving problems. So I would like to make maybe this is just some idea to make it, saying TAT, to have like TART, and or maybe shows a reflection. Because now if you want to teach, assess, and teach again, but what about the communication between the way that we assess, but a student requires to understand, okay, what's wrong? You have reflection session, and then again,
wonderful.
teach.
I mean, thank you. That's wonderful.
Sorry.
And it's funny you should say that. In the app that I've designed, there is reflection. So somewhere I must have had that, because we get the children to then say, you did it this way, why did you do it this way, what worked and what didn't work. So they have to reflect on their problem solving. So, yeah, thanks. That's great. I can add that, definitely.
I just want to ask, in terms of setting the challenges or whatever you call them in the app, how do you factor in the nuances in what you mentioned earlier, the cultural capital or the capital that the learners or the students, if we're talking higher education, come with? Or how do you mine, for lack of a better word, those things?
Okay, I mean, that's an excellent question, because we live in a multicultural society, and we can either pretend we don't and dig a hole and put our heads in it, or we can actually build history and culture into it. And that's why I use cultural historical theory, okay? I don't see anybody as coming as a blank slate to me. They come with centuries of who they are. And it's very tricky. In school, it's not so tricky, okay? In school, I mean, you have to learn. One thing you have to learn in grade 5 is photosynthesis, okay? It's terribly badly taught. I don't know if many of you have seen CRAPS, CAPS, our curriculum. It's got some it teaches matter without ever, and I mean, this is amazing, because this is like, you had to really be drugged and asleep. They teach matter without ever once referring to it as having been made of atomic particles. That's amazing. I mean, teaching matter without mentioning the atomic nature of matter takes a special kind of silly, okay? So yes, it is difficult, but at school it's easier. At higher education, it is difficult. So what do? I try to get problems like that conceptual diagram that nobody really has a feeling for. It's outside of culture. Not really, because shape is part of culture and so is number and whatever. But it's about as far out of culture as I can get at the moment. But you're dead right. How do we set these problems? You need to know who your students are. Do you do a demographic questionnaire at the beginning of each year and find out who they are, where they come from, how many kids they have, blah, blah, etc. I do. And then I look, and then I generate problems that use their skill set to solve. Yeah.
A final comment because of time.
Thank you, Prof. From my side, it is just a comment, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm Ms. Lupondo from the Faculty of Business and Management Sciences at CPUT. Something that I actually took note of from your presentation is that as the institution, I think we're moving to a right direction. We just adopted now a One Smart CPUT, a Vision 2030, and you're talking about teach, assess, teach, pedagogy, which is now, I'm referring now to our context. We just changed our acronyms from teaching, learning, and assessment to learning, teach, and assess, which is more of adopting and understanding what the students know so that you can be able to teach and feed to what they need to know, and then you assess. But something that I took note of as well is the sophistication of the technology that we require in order to be successful and effective to what we want to do. And in all of that, it actually changes the role of the teacher to a facilitator role, because you're more of facilitating learning now. You have to ensure that there's learning that takes place through the use of technology, which means, going back to what Prof. Swema was asking earlier on, why only now? I think it is now time for the institution to decide on what technology that we can use. There are a number of artificial intelligence platforms that we could use to ensure that we do this right.
And just to thank you very much for that. Just to remind you that AI and you, not AI and you are brilliant. You're all academics, right? You're all brilliant, okay? You can put your head in there, okay? I just want to, and by the way, your university's going to say there's no money. When you said 325 billion by 2025, I nearly fell off my chair. I thought, let me get out here and go and get my app and try and sell it now. 325 billion, I could do with it. There's money. But we've got to be smart and use our knowledge and know how to externalize that. We've all got it. We're all experts. Let's use it. Thank you. And let me just say, I unfortunately have to leave early for a personal issue, but my email is available, and I welcome discussions from everybody. This is a new journey for me. It's an exciting journey. I'm not a scientist. I don't know much about science. I have scientists on my team. I would love to engage in discussions on teaching and learning with anyone. So you do have my email, and I'd love to. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Hartman, not so fast, not so fast. This is the part I enjoy most. Thank you very much for sharing us your time and your knowledge and the presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks very much.
We're now going to break for a 15-minute tea break. I will call you back again. And Zaid, we just go across this way and indulge in the delicacies that we have on the what do you call that? A counter over there. It's a real counter. Right. Thank you, everybody.
Sonia, yes. Very lovely meeting you.
So this is not displaying what it should. See this one? There we go.
There we go.
But you have to.
So you just need to get that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll encourage you to get something to eat, something to drink. We've got a very heavy schedule after tea.
Does that say murder? Yay! Okay, I've got it right.
I never know how to use these things.
Yeah, now I can. I'm ready to yeah. So I only know that because it happened to me last week.
Okay.
But my words are gone. Okay, there it is. Okay, this is not the one mine. So that's yours. The words go away, comes back. Okay, so that's your one.
Perfect.
Excuse me?
You want to present on the iPad or?
Yeah, I'm going to use my iPad. That's fine. Thanks, and I'm going to use emotes. So I'll be sorted. Thanks. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, emote.
3 minutes, everybody. 3 minutes, please. 3 minutes. One minute. Can I ask that everybody return to their seats, please? As soon as you've gotten your cup of coffee, can we take our seats? Thank you, everybody. We're about to start the second session. This is where we get the meat on the bones. To the people that are still seeing to their coffee, can I ask that we, with great haste, find our seats again? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you that this is an in-person gathering. We are not at home now where we are at our kettles. Right, as I said earlier, we are in this is the business side of the session today. This is where we pack the meat onto the bones that were laid down for us earlier. Our speaker we're going to have 4 speakers now. 3 speakers and then Prof. Candice Livingston to sum it all up for us at the end of the day. Our next speaker, Dr. Sonia Strydom, is the Deputy Director of the Academic Development and Research at the Center for Learning Technologies and is a Research Fellow at the Center for Higher and Adult Education at Stellenbosch University. She holds a PhD in Education from the University of Stellenbosch and a D.Lit et Phil in psychology from the University of South Africa. She teaches on a number of short and postgraduate higher education programs at Stellenbosch University, regionally and internationally. She's also one of the co-founders of the African Digital University Network. Her current research interest is in the field of digital mediated curriculum development, critical digital pedagogies, and artificial intelligence in education. I'm particularly interested in a line in a topic, between a rock and a hard place. Sonia?
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for your time and for the very kind invitation, Professor Wachit. It's really much appreciated. It's always, I can't decide whether it's a good thing to be before tea time or after tea time, but I want to say that I think it's a positive one, that everybody is now comfortable after the very interesting first session that we had this morning. Now, colleagues, you'll see that the heading of my talk today is Increased Educational Online Engagement and Future Automation Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And I thought about this heading and whether it is a sensible thing to start off with. But I do believe that especially a day like today is an opportunity for us to contemplate and to discuss, and also perhaps also acknowledge that sometimes we don't have all the answers that we so desperately hope for. So, colleagues, in terms of our work that we've done, and we've touched on this already, so this is not really something new. We're all aware of the fact that the pandemic actually exposed deeply rooted inequalities in higher education. Whilst all of us had to actually embrace the digital to continue with access, and then, of course, also with the academic project. And when universities, all of us, chose to embrace the digital, it helped us, in a sense, to at least move the curriculum online. It helped, but at the end of the day, our students from specifically disadvantaged backgrounds paid the price. And we're very aware of that as well, and some institutions experienced much more than others as well. We know that students, especially from remote areas, had difficulty access online resources, attending online classes, and there are numerous reasons for that as well. And of course, to further complicate matters is the fact that many of these students that had difficulty accessing these resources also had limited access to cultural capital, and we spoke about that a bit earlier on as well. We all know that wealthy carers very often have the financial means to actually support, and the know-how, to support students in terms of providing the necessary hardware and software, as well as providing appropriate learning spaces for students to work in as well. Now, we as an institution at Stellenbosch University as well, we also reflected on our practices and our experiences during the pandemic, and you'll see that here's an online book that many colleagues, teaching academics and colleagues from the professional academic support services worked on it. We reflected on our experiences during the pandemic as well. And of course, albeit our experience is much different from many other institutions, the question remains, and it remained at that stage as well, how do we move forward from a pandemic pedagogy? What have we learned? And of course, what are the opportunities and pitfalls that we need to avoid? So please allow me today to actually cast some light on which I think a possible way forward is by actually looking and considering these multifaceted dimensions associated with our deliberations about teaching, learning, assessment, and our education, by actually trying to explain it by means of a socio-material or material perspective. Most of us are aware of the fact that in social science research specifically, it's situated in a being ontology. What that means is that we assume distinct differences between the social and between technical entities. And that's the way in which we do our research as well. We try to distinguish between these entities. Now, socio-new materialism, on the other hand, actually place emphasis on the heightened status also of the material, the physical. So that could be anything from laptops, hardware, internet, data, all of those things as well. So especially during the pandemic, I remember the quote of Karen Barrett that made me reconsider the status of the material and the role of technology in our then daily lives, but also today and in the way forward. And Barrett argues that the material, the physical, has been silent, a very silent partner in our scholarly practices for much too long. And if you read the quote here on the slide, she says here, language matters, culture matters, and the only thing that doesn't seem to matter is matter. The physical seems to be out of our narratives the whole time. So such a view where we actually propose a heightened level of importance of the material, is called a relational ontology. And with such an approach, we attempt to challenge the conventional boundaries that we've set ourselves between the human and the non-human. And that's so interesting because I listened to the previous question about the role of a teacher in these TLA practices as well. And with the relational ontology, we say that there's a heightened status of the material, and that there's an equal status between the human and the non-human entity as well. It starts, a relational ontology actually starts to place emphasis also on the agency of the non-human as well. All right, so let's just keep that very abstract thought just in the back of our heads for a moment. Another dimension of a relational ontology, let's just quickly see there if I'm on the right slide, yes. Another dimension of the relational ontology is also that we could think about the entanglements or the interactions between different concepts. Now, what does it mean if I refer to an entanglement? Those of you familiar with social material theory will know that sometimes we refer to entanglements, interactions, assemblages as well, depending on the scholar and the work that we're following at that stage. But the essence is exactly the same. It argues for an inseparability between the material and between the social. So in our case, it would be an inseparability between our thoughts, our actions, the words that we use, and everything else that forms part of our dialogues and our activities and our actions on a daily basis. So entanglements do not place emphasis on fixed boundaries that are upheld by restricted convictions. Actually, it focuses on much more fluidness, a fluid relationship between these type of entities. And it argues actually that we don't provide priority to the one or the other. Hence our reference to a relational ontology. So what does that mean in practice? It's very abstract, it's a very theoretical idea in which we look at it. I would like to argue that the pandemic paved the way in many instances for a relational ontology to be considered in order to establish a way forward, and that we think differently about the role of the material and the non-material in our deliberations as we move forward. And I would like to highlight 3 types of entanglements. You see that here on the slide that I believe could actually impact our current and our future orientations in relation to teaching, learning and assessment as well. The 3 dimensions you'll see here is at the top there. The first one is expectations, and it's very broad: institutional expectations, lecturer expectations, and student expectations. Secondly, I'm referring to our own praxis, our teaching, learning, and assessment practices. And then third but not least, epistemological access. In other words, knowledge. And the previous Joanne also spoke about knowledge as well. So you'll note that in the next couple of slides that I won't be discussing these concepts in a linear fashion, but I'd rather try to attempt to demonstrate the interconnected nature between these constructs that I believe that are all directly or indirectly actually impacting our choices about our post-pandemic practices as well. So let's have a look, for instance, at expectations and our teaching and learning and assessment practices. Despite the well-documented challenges that we've discussed and that we all experienced during the pandemic, higher education institutions still believe that the use of digital technologies could pave the way towards inclusivity and access as well. To me, it's very interesting to read the literature post-COVID and to see what scholars say about the role of the digital as well. Blended learning as a mode of delivery, but also as a pedagogical approach, seems to be a pivoting approach towards such goals of inclusivity, access, etc. And albeit not a revolutionary term, we're all familiar with that, and we're all comfortable that we know what we refer to there. Many scholars still argue that with the expectations created during the pandemic, that blended learning could assist higher education institutions in working towards a more digitized future. And we hear that in our conversations as well. For instance, I'm just quoting one of the African scholars, Shimbarasha, actually is of the opinion that blended learning could actually especially help previously disadvantaged institutions to address the digital divide and enable them to draw closer to historically advantaged institutions as well. So you see there are very lofty and fantastic optimistic ideas, that message of hope in terms of the consideration of specific blended learning. And another movement that is closely aligned with the growing interest and prominence of blended learning is the increasing acknowledgement of the role and influence of the fourth industrial revolution. It's a term that we've been using regularly as well, and specifically then artificial intelligence in education. Often higher education institutions and academics, many of us here today, are motivated and challenged to incorporate the digital and learning and teaching practices in order to prepare our students for a digitized future. And we see that specifically if we think of graduate attributes, if we think of competencies of students, these are the type of things that we engage with on a daily basis. Artificial intelligence in education, AI Ed, as we call it, has been promoted as a means of personalization of the student learning experience, making use of chatbots, digital assistants, promoting adaptive learning, intelligent tutor systems, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on. We've got all these wonderful things that we can consider and that we can think of as well. It's even in a sense, just in the UK, actually calls this the next blend in education, AI Ed. So this is our world that we currently live in, with all these expectations, with all these conversations going on as well. Now, my argument is that with all these expectations, really can we isolate material from the non-material? If we think about the way in which we engage in these debates as well. So how do we make sense of these interactions and these entanglements? I would like to argue for the value and the importance of epistemological access, or knowledge at least, that we need to broaden our own knowledge and understanding of these all interconnected facets in order to be able to move forward. So let me illustrate it by means of a couple of examples. Let's think back to the previous slide where we looked at blended learning pedagogy. And that I say that many scholars, if you look at the literature, it's really one of the buzzwords suddenly again after the pandemic. Now, albeit viewed as a very popular instructional method, or then a pedagogical approach as well, one of the main problems and challenges experienced by academics, and we can talk about that the whole day, we're very aware of that, is to foster a culture of student engagement and participation in a blended online space. I'm sure that all of us experience it in some form or another, specifically also during the pandemic, but also post-pandemic as well. And as to be expected, that transactional distance between students and peers, but then also between peers, or students rather, and the lecturers, actually contribute to students' reluctance to engage in these online activities. Another evident challenge is also, of course, the fact that very often the online doesn't provide opportunity for spontaneous interactions. Another question or aspect that I'm very interested in my own research at this stage is the space and the place for affect, emotion. How do we bring that into the digital space as well? the spontaneous nature of learning, the spontaneous nature of interaction as well, and that's where my interest also lies in terms of critical digital pedagogies. So in order to effectively utilize blended learning, we need to think of our instructional models, we need to think of our learning design, and we need to think of ways in which you can incorporate all our students' voices into the learning space. But do we really think about these things? Do we have proper and appropriate knowledge to be able to move that forward in the way in which we work on a daily basis? Let's take the other example of AI Ed, artificial intelligence in education. Many scholars, myself included, are currently looking at the possibilities of artificial intelligence in education. But many are also critiquing AI Ed in terms of the aspects such as biases in algorithms, students and staff not truly understanding what's happening with student data, those type of things. And we're very much aware of the commercial involvement in building future education systems that are focused on optimization, but typically these are people that are technical experts, but they're not experts in education. So we don't hear the educational voices coming into these narratives as well. So scholars are actually asking educationalists, and if you read the literature about AI Ed and the critiquing about that, you'll see that the argument is actually that we as scholars, we as people sitting here today, academics, need to engage with the methodological, the theoretical, the practical, and the political intersection of these digital tools as we move forward and as we start to consider artificial intelligence in education as well. And then, of course, we think of context, and we're all aware of that. It's one word that I always say in higher education that you hear on a daily basis, reference to context. But there's value in that. So in terms of our knowledge, need to be rooted in our unique context. If I could quote Professor Laura Chanovich, that I think most of us know, and some of you know, I know that also participated in this paper in 2020, where she says, she and the other colleagues says, that the focus on digital technology will inevitably play out differently across the different higher education sectors, given the variety of institutional types categorized in different ways: rural and urban, old and new, historically advantaged, historically disadvantaged, research intensive, comprehensive, universities of technology. So all of us bring something different to these conversations, and all of us have different contexts that we need to consider and that we need to work with and work through as well. So what is our way forward? How do we move forward from this perhaps very abstract concept, all these entanglements, all these interactions that I'm referring to here as well? My presentation today does provide us with a possible list of actions moving further. There's not a tick list, nor does it suggest that I want to, how to embrace these pitfalls and how to avoid them. I'd rather suggest a deepened understanding and appreciation of the potential agentic impact that the material could actually have on our thoughts and our actions and our words. The material joining us here at our tables today, I see all these laptops, for instance. The question is therefore not anymore if or how we should consider the material in our teaching and learning and assessment endeavors, but rather how to be and become knowledgeable enough to engage in critical conversations and debates about the interrelatedness between the material and the non-material when we think of our own educational practices and the way forward with it. If we do not continue to educate ourselves, our colleagues, management, and even students, we will inevitably remain between a rock and a hard place. We want to move forward, but we don't know how to move forward. So thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Strydom. Any questions from the floor? Over there.
Thank you, Dr. Strydom, for that really interesting presentation. So the thought that comes up for me in terms of, especially working with new materialism is how we position ourselves. And so my question to you is, as academics, as teachers in this particular space, how do we reimagine who we are? Because I think part of the challenges sometimes that we face with is that we hold on to the traditional roles, and if we were to see space matter as equal within this particular environment, would that require of us to reconsider who we are, and who would be considered teachers in this particular space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question, also something that I grapple with on a daily basis. Because the thing with the relation ontology, it speaks of, in my understanding, the role of agency there. So you'll also hear that, remember that I said that it doesn't mean that the human does not have agency. It's agency in both cases, and the one is not prioritized over the other. So in my mind, the way in which I understand it, and which I try to make meaning of this, is that as teachers, as scholars, as academics, whichever way we identify, is that we still have agency in whichever realm or area that we work in. For me, perhaps what is more important is to understand and to acknowledge that the physical, that the matter, actually, whether we knew it or not, also communicated and had an impact on our choices that we made at the end. And to me, there's a distinct shift between the two worlds of us sitting back and thinking that I'm actually in control, from a social materialist perspective, of course, but that I'm in control and I decide. And it came back to me when I thought of the pandemic and all our conversations. We made choices based on what we had, we did not have, in terms of the material. So actually, that had an impact on our choices and our practices in a sense as well. But in my mind, it doesn't take away our level of agency. In my mind, it provides us with an opportunity just to think broader and try to think of how could one manage these types of aspects as well, so that it becomes a cohesive whole when we start to engage with our practices moving forward. So I hope I've answered your question there.
Yes.
Zabun?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Strydom.
Sonia.
Thank you, Sonia, for a lot of much food for thought. Just a comment. We are now at that moment in history where we are looking at what the university, what an institution of a higher education means.
Yes.
Institution, what it means. And so you quoted, and I'm so sorry, it slipped my mind now, the name of this African scholar who is of the opinion that what we're living through now is an opportunity to bring what is it now? To close the gap between the traditional, historically advantaged institutions and those who are known as, historically disadvantaged. But I'm often wondering, is this not the moment where it's an ideal opportunity to close that gap and bring something in the middle, not that the template is that, historically advantaged institutions, but that we are actually coming down from that purge where we put those historically advantaged institutions and bring something completely different to, I think this is that moment. I often think of it, is this not where we have to really reconsider? Because the template is still there, that what is being accepted as our traditional universities and how they operate, Barry.
There must be a question, Zabun.
No, it's just a comment, because there is something that you mentioned, that this scholar said that is it not the time to close that gap? It's almost, I feel that it is, they are there and that we should aspire to that. There should be something.
I think
Dr.
it's
Strydom, can you respond to that?
Yeah, of course. I think that's a very valuable and very important and powerful comment that you are making. And I'm always hesitant when we have these type of discussions as well, because I know I come with a certain degree of privilege to any form of conversation being linked to a specific institution at this stage. And in my mind, you're completely right in terms of thinking anew, and we're busy with those conversations in our institution as well. We're thinking about rethinking the notion of graduate attributes, for instance, rethinking our teaching and learning policy and strategy as well. What does it mean for a graduate of the future? What does that mean? So in other words, I completely agree with you. Minding the gap and bridging a gap, in my mind, is not anymore about that, or that. It's moving forward as a cohesive whole and trying to find that space that works for all of us, given our unique contexts and our unique students that we bring to the conversation as well. So thank you so much for that comment.
Hi, Sonia. Thank you for the presentation. You know, I was thinking about this idea of automation and this idea that our colleague brought up around context. And, you know, the myth is that technology, you know, reinforces or doesn't reinforce inequality, it evens things out, but actually it's a myth. Because students in rural and, like you were saying, in urban areas, they don't access the technology in the same way. Yet we're speaking about automation. And if we type in to Google, I want a picture of a sun, Google's going to give you 1 million pictures of a sun. Google's never seen the sun before because we've inputted information so that Google understands that. So in the education space, if we're going to input information, especially, for example, at a privileged institution, how then do we make sure that that information is valid for the context of the specific student? So I don't know, my question's a bit loaded, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are around that.
I think it's $1 million question, and I think that's the dilemma with AI Ed, for instance. And I've read about it, and if you're interested in that field, please read the work of Jeremy Knox. He's done a lot of work on AI Ed and inclusivity, diversity, and equality. And he's critiquing AI Ed for the purpose that the argument is that actually, can we truly, with increased automation at this stage, really ensure that all our voices, all our students are actually benefiting from such a system? And that's why I gave you that list about, you know, the tutors and the chatbots, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds fantastic, and by no means am I suggesting that it's not. And that's why I want to bring it back to what I said about our knowledge, our understanding of this, and the call for us as scholars and as academics to actively engage with these aspects and to ensure that we ourselves know what's happening before we can consider that in a teaching and learning space as well, with all the potential pitfalls and, of course, opportunities as well. So absolutely, I don't think, and that's what I said in the beginning, I don't think there's an answer at this stage, but it's something to keep our eyes wide open about and to engage with those scholarly debates as well. Thanks for that, Simone.
Sonia, just before you step away, I was going to ask before the previous speaker had asked the question. So, is yours a discourse of hope or a discourse of caution?
I think it's a combined one. To be honest with you, so can I get my chocolate? I'm joking.
Because, yeah, it's half full, half empty. Or
it is, but having said all of that, you are here today because we all want to learn, myself included. So in terms of creating opportunities for knowledge and to learn more, and that access, I think is happening already. So for me, that is a very strong message of hope that we have here already. So, but that we need to be cautious in terms of not just rushing in. To me, I think that remains important.
And foregrounding those assumptions that are lying there.
Yes.
Sonia, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And you gave the correct answer. That's your chocolate.
Thank you so much.
she was one of those dream presenters that give you 4 minutes into the program. She managed to finish up on time, and that's a hint to the next speaker. Yeah. So our next speaker is Simone Titus. She's an associate professor and teaching and learning specialist in the Interprofessional Education Unit in the Faculty of Community and Health Sciences at the University of the Western Cape. She graduated with a PhD in education from the University of Cape Town, where she developed an interest in the use of emerging technologies as a tool to mediate learning. Her special research interests are focused on game-based learning and using emerging technology to foster cross-cultural interaction, learning, and engagement in higher education. She was the recipient of the Black Academic Advancement Program, where a specific research focus is on the use of augmented reality and virtual reality on health sciences education. She is the current chairperson of the Western Cape Region branch of the Southern African Association of Health Educationists. Simone may be, well, yeah, she may be contacted via email. Simone?
Thank you, Barry. Just get out of here. Thank you. Sorry, I just want to grab my presentation. It's not that one. Okay, good morning, colleagues. My name is Simone Titus. I am a learning and teaching specialist in the Faculty of Community and Health Sciences, and today I'm going to be speaking more along the lines of some of the work I've done as part of a BAR project, which looked at virtual reality and augmented reality in health professions education. And my work predominantly focuses on, how do we get students to learn anatomy and physiology when they're actually not able to access the labs? They're not able to, see a live artifact or a real piece of material. So to start, let's look at what is virtual reality and augmented reality. So augmented reality is when you use a headset or a smartphone to overlay images or content into your physical world. So for example, Snapchat, you see everybody with these ears and puppy dog faces, or if you just Google a lion, you'll see that you're able to superimpose a lion on the table, for example. So, it's very slow here, sorry. So what essentially it does is it allows your camera screen to superimpose these objects. Virtual reality, on the other hand, is something that is a lot more immersive. So you put on a headset. Sometimes some of these headsets are rather expensive. And you're actually able to interact with a computer-generated image of whatever it is that you want. So for me, it's anatomy. And so you as the user or your student would then able to access by means of sight, hearing, motion, and they're fully immersed in an environment that is computer-generated but in very, very high resolution. So sometimes there are motion tracking systems in it. You get really good devices at this time. So the question really then is, why would we want to use virtual reality and augmented reality, not just in health professions education, but in education in general? So Horizon reports and EduCause have indicated that, it's a trend in medical education. And so what it allows then is that students are able to interact and engage with artifacts in a manner that allows them to develop skills, an array of skills and knowledge, especially in health sciences where anatomy and physiology are the cornerstones of their professions or their disciplines. So if they are unable to understand the structure, the function and location of, say, a particular muscle, they are unable then to effectively investigate, they are unable to do investigations effectively because they don't have the knowledge on the organs and the tissues, etc. So what this means is that if we are able to immerse them in a synthetic environment, potentially they'd be able to engage and interact a lot differently with learning materials because now we are able to integrate those artifacts within their physical world. So there are many benefits of using virtual reality and augmented reality. So some of the literature, especially in the EduCause reports at the moment, are saying that it allows for the development of scientific literacy skills, and it allows students to solve problems that are rather authentic if it is designed accordingly with the academic. So the content knowledge and the skills that they develop allows for that sort of experiential learning environment that allows for students to go through that particular process. So virtual reality also enables users, especially in health sciences, to access parts of the body that they wouldn't necessarily be able to access otherwise. So they can go inside the human heart, they can go inside a vein, they can go inside an artery to see exactly what that looks like. So it provides this idea of, or gives us this idea that the learning is a bit more rich, and it allows us to create a particular context within health professions education. In my space, we speak about core competencies, which I think also exists in various other environments. So, for example, the idea of working in teams, the idea of communicating. So there are core competencies that it allows our health profession students to attain, but then also engage in a learning context or an authentic learning context where you're able to mimic a real world. So think about putting a student into a hospital or a classroom that looks and feels like a South African classroom, where there are the desks look a certain way, the walls look a certain way. And I'll show an example of how we can possibly do that. So the other benefit of this is that the patient's safety is safeguarded, because you can do an operation or investigate an anatomical conundrum or challenge without risk to a real patient, because you can do this over and over. You can dissect incorrectly 1,000,000 times, and there's no patient that is at risk. But it allows students to, it allows for prolonged engagement with content over a period of time. What I like about it is that it allows us to do this virtually. It allows us to do it face-to-face, and it allows us to do it in a hybrid manner. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's a case study. This was developed by Jigspace, who is the service provider that we use to build all our virtual objects. So what they did was nursing students, and I'm using this specifically because I know that WCCN is part of CPUT. What they did was they realized that students couldn't get to the clinical placements. And so they built this, what they call a panda baby warmer. And I don't want to go into it now because I think it's a little bit slow. And what they've done was they've allowed students to put together the baby warmer so that they could take an ABCAR score. And what this does is it takes students through 52 steps: how to plug in the baby warmer, how to switch it on, how to put the oxygen tank in, how to place the baby, how to switch on the warmer, then how to read an ABCAR score. ABCAR. So it allows for this interactivity, and it immerses the student in a very contextual, real-world environment where they're able to learn these activities. So before we got to this space, we were reading books, and much of what we offered students was text and symbols, and that was how we communicated what we wanted. However, we've now, and it doesn't mean that it's no longer relevant for education, but we've moved on to 3D objects that actually allows for understanding of, for example, anatomical structures, biomolecular structures, and different types of architecture. So I just want to tell you a bit of what I did. So I did this in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So during lockdown, during a softer lockdown, and then this year when we were sort of in a hybrid space. And I did an intervention with students on a different platform. It was called Eon XR. And what I did was I asked staff for their anatomy lectures, rebuilt all the anatomy lectures in 3D objects, chucked it into Eon. It sounds easy. Put it into Eon, and then built lessons around it. So basically, what you see on the screen are lessons that were built, and students are able to, what I first did was I went into the classroom virtually, did this online, and students were given a lesson that I built in the system, and they are able to do locations, they're able to do quizzes, and they're able to type in the names of the anatomical structures. Now, you can do this with anything. I know there's a science lecturer in the room. It can literally be with any type of object that students can look at. They can rotate, they can turn it upside down, they can dissect it, they can do whatever they want with it. And so, I'm not going to go through that. The other thing that we've done in terms of virtual reality and 3D was build 3D walks of our campuses. So those of us who are teaching science out in the field, what can happen if students are unable to access is to do 360 images of the activities. So I built a 3D walk of our campus. I work on a dual campus of our health sciences building. And what this allowed for was first, when students were not able to access campus, they were then able to go onto the app and actually walk around the clinical floors on our nursing floors and our physiotherapy floors. And we built in hotspots, like this is where we do defibrillation, and you can do an AR. You can then superimpose a defib machine, and we'd embed a YouTube clip about what that particular asset does. So the point I'm trying to make is that this can be done not just in a health environment, but across campus. So if those are doing education, one could probably then go into a real classroom and do a 360 image and build hotspots for students. What was interesting in the data was that students actually were not familiar with the concepts of AR and VR, which refutes our ideas that students are immersed and they know what technology is. But actually, very few of them had an understanding or familiarity with what this was. So 76% of participants actually had not tried virtual reality or augmented reality, and these were first-year students. And they've also not used it for educational purposes. Whether they've used it for anatomy and physiology, similarly, close to 80% of students said that they've never used this as a learning tool for anatomy and physiology. However, many of them said that, you know what, this environment could actually work because we can then understand the various muscle groups a lot better than, when they are in the classroom. So then they're also saying that the environment where one can see human anatomy and work on various muscle groups, so you can practice in that environment. So innately, despite them not knowing what this really is, they actually understand the benefits of what it can do. My work is also in interprofessional education, so looking at how two or more professions work together to achieve particular health outcomes. So it can be a nurse, a physiotherapist, a social worker, etc. And students were saying, well, you know what, we can actually build an environment where interdisciplinary teams can work together to improve the healthcare system. However, we need to consider what this digital divide looks like. We need to consider what the context looks like. And there's this idea around what is called the Matthew effect. So despite students having access to some of this, which, by the way, they are saying the reason we don't use it is because it's too expensive. The Matthew effect tells us that despite the digital divide has two things. One is that they don't have access to the technology, but two, those who have access to the technology might not have the resources and the know-how to actually use it, and so the knowledge that they're able to gain from using it is quite diminished. There are some students are actually saying, well, you know what, this is cool to use, but my concern is that it's expensive to implement, and also what if I feel dizzy? using this. So again, there are other ethical challenges that we need to consider when implementing some of these technologies. And so students are also offering us some, in terms of trying to co-create what this might look like going forward, is that apart from, the negative comments around the fact that it might be expensive, or assuming, that it's pricey, and that it might cause headaches or vertigo and things like that, students are actually saying that it would be good in education because, it brings the experience closer to the participant. It also allows for an augmented view of the world that takes away the physical touch of humans, but it still allows sensory aspects to remain. So it removes also the risk of transmitting diseases or other viruses. So that was also one of the challenges that one of the interesting comments that they've brought up. And then lastly, they were actually saying that it captures the attention so that they're able to learn more and understand what is happening, within the classroom setting. So I'm going to end with some of my own very brief concluding thoughts, is that the claims that, some of these technologies is not new to our students is refuted because our students are saying, what, in our context, we are not familiar with augmented and virtual reality. And so that means something. And I think it's something that we need to take into consideration, especially when we're looking at students who are accessing these platforms from either urban or rural areas. The challenge might remain is that when we develop these applications, it might be something that they get exposed to in the real world. So how then are we then able to prepare students within an authentic learning classroom to create an environment that really mimics the real world? So when they enter the workforce, they are able to easily take up those opportunities. The other thing is that, the exact impact of the future of higher education in health sciences and I think in other professions and society is largely unknown. So the idea of AI, the idea of virtual reality and augmented reality is potential right now is not really known. And so I think we can leverage off that to create new spaces within our classrooms that allow us to, mimic real world environments and allow for authentic learning to take place within our classrooms. So my opinion is that there's a need for higher education institutions to respond to some of these initiatives, to effect not just positive social change, but also change within the sector in terms of how we deliver educational activities. And then at this time, we have an opportunity to look at some of the strategic positioning of our institutions. There has to be institutional will and money for some of these things. So how then do we move our institutions forward so that we are able to develop 21st century digital citizens? And then lastly, for me, the way forward in my space, and I do work in anatomy and physiology, is look at how we can implement anatomy lessons in this way, in a hybrid manner, which we've done, which I've done to a certain extent, because you can do this using desktop applications. But then also look at other 3D walks of real clinical settings, but without putting risk, ethical challenges and putting risk to anyone who we might be taking photos of. And then the other thing I was thinking about when Zaid asked me to present is this idea of compassionate learning design. And how do we consider who our students are when we offer these bright ideas? Because not all students are interested in this and they have other challenges. And so how do we embed care and compassion within some of these activities that we do? I went very quickly. So thank you very much. The reason is because I wanted to show you what the Panda Baby does, but thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Prof. Titus. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions we've got 1 and 2 coming up.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Widad, and I'm from the University of Cape Town. Thank you so much for this very inspiring presentation. I've learned so much. So I can understand how VR and AR can allow for access to different opportunities for different types of students in different subjects and so forth. But I'm wondering, what about students with learning disabilities, you know? So on one hand, we're providing a lot of access for so-called normal students, but what about students with disabilities? Has your research in any way, you know, touched on that or found anything?
No, I've not necessarily focused on students with learning disabilities. However, when we design, for example, the YouTube clips that are embedded within a defibrillator application, we consider universal design for learning principles. So a student who is hearing impaired, we'd make sure that there are closed captions. A student who is visually impaired, you know, you create the application in such a way that it can be enhanced or made bigger on either tablet or the laptop, depending on the assistive devices that they do have. So that is the long and short sort of answer that I can give you, but it's just how we consider things like UDL within the design of the content that we place within some of the applications. Making sense?
Hi, Simone, Samantha from CPUT Education Faculty. So I know that your focus has been on students, but my question is, how has, I know at the beginning you said that you had taken all the content that the lecturers had, and you, obviously it was not an easy task. How was their reaction, or how do lecturers actually respond to something like this and them using something like this in the classroom?
Yeah, I think for me what has actually helped was I went through what we call our blended learning champions. And because they had an interest in transforming the curriculum and renewing the curriculum, they were willing to offer their slides and their lecture notes for us to develop some of these applications. However, because of the time that they need, you know, in that 14 weeks of a semester, it was very difficult to access the class. And so we could only do a lesson once or twice with some of the students, which was enough because if we do the skull, there are 3 skull lessons that we would do in that particular lecture. We also then were able to access the tutor classes, where we then show them how we've embedded it into the LMS so that the students can then access it themselves. So the lecturers sort of just have to have the will to collaborate, but it wasn't mandatory. We didn't police anything. But I think when they saw the innovation, they were quite interested.
Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself the first time. Amanda Morris, I'm from CPUT Design. And I had 2 questions. One, access issue that often comes up just with, for example, when someone applies to do medicine, there's this requirement of having done some community work or clinical hours. So that one question was whether you think something like this would help in those who don't necessarily have access to a clinic in their village or in their community to get some sort of experience before they apply within health sciences. And then the second part was, what's always interesting is when you get feedback like what you have from the students. My question often is about the voices that are not there because they couldn't access the platform or the VR. So how do you, I don't know how to, but how do you factor in those who can't, for whom it's not accessible, because their voices would also be missing from your data?
Yeah. So, you know, to answer the first question in terms of, you know, is there a way to allow a student to access a clinic in their area? We've not reached that because they've said my idea is impossible. So the dream has always been to build an environment, a clinic, where there's a patient laying, the patient is black, blue, purple, Indian, Muslim, whatever, you know, the diversity is. And you have teams of students working virtually on a patient with different health challenges or social needs. But that particular type of activity has never been done, and it's the collaboration in AR and VR has not ever been done. So that is something that we'll work on, and the developers have said maybe in a year or two we'd be able to do something like that. So it's been flagged, but it's not, apparently it's not possible. I cannot believe it, but apparently it's not possible. And then to answer your second question around voices, we've tried as much as we can to get the voices of the students through surveys and things like that, and we know that students have questionnaire fatigue, so they don't necessarily answer, so we don't get the voices of those students. However, when we do go into the classrooms, we build it through the LMS, so students don't necessarily have to access the application, but we do desktop VR via the LMS. So we often find that with those data-free, through the data-free portals, students access these spaces a lot more, and then we get their voices through the chat, through those chat functions. So that was the one way that we got some of the missing voices, I want to say.
Good morning, Prof.
Hi.
My name is Lebohang Mahlo. I'm a DED student, CPUT. I also work for the Western Cape Education Department. You spoke mostly about higher education institutions. I am not sure if this is being used in primary schools or secondary schools. What about primary schools or high schools for a subject, for example, a life science subject or any other subject? Can this be something that can be used by learners in high schools or primary schools? Thank you.
Absolutely. Actually, there's a picture on the screen, and on the bottom right, I did a project for Lego, and what you see on the screen is me going into an under-resourced school in the Mitchells Plain area, and they were doing work on the exoskeleton. I then found artifacts on what used to be called Google Expedition, and we superimposed the crab into the classroom to understand, what exoskeletons are. What then happened was, because augmented reality superimposes an object in the real world, the object was superimposed on the learner's leg, and they ran. All of the students just ran. I'm laughing at it now, but it wasn't funny at the time because they screamed. And then we sort of had to bring them back. So it was an unintended consequence from my side. I was not aware that that would happen because it was a giant crab that we had used. So I want to say, yes, it can if it is designed in the correct way. So students need to be made aware of what it does. But once they realize what it does, they were absolutely fascinated because they could rotate this thing, they could split it, they could X-ray it, it could dissect. So yes, it is absolutely possible, and you can build hotspots into it where you can give them a YouTube clip, or you standing there and explaining what this exoskeleton is, what it does, why we use it, etc. So it can be done with any, in any grade, yeah.
Last question.
Good morning. I'm Genevieve Lentz, and I'm a lecturer in the education faculty. So I'm very interested because I know I spoke a bit about AR and VR in my master's thesis, but how plausible is it to implement in the education faculty, considering teaching practice, and also considering the challenges that I've experienced with hybrid, with online learning. I had my students present the lesson plans and teach online, but they miss that interaction with the students because that's what kind of gets them to continue with their teaching. So how plausible is it?
So I just want to go back to the example of the panda baby. So what they've done in that particular environment was that they built this AR space or VR space, but then they allowed for certain questions and they allowed for the interactivity. So they would say, go to the plug, switch the plug on. So you can build the environment. My opinion is that you can build the environment, but with certain milestones or learning points in place. So you might not get the interactivity with the learner, but you can simulate that within the environment, if that makes any sense. So if, for example, you decide to do something like that, you can plonk a 360 camera in a classroom, take a picture of it, it's completely 360, and you build hotspots into it. So you can then stage the classroom, and you can put certain students in certain places, and once you click on that student might have a learning difficulty, and you place the challenge there, and you allow students to respond to it in that way. And then you just do that with, in my opinion, with different students. It's been done at the University of Missouri, where they did it with autistic students, where they were able to put all the students on the mat, but each of those students had a particular challenge, and that allowed the therapist then or the therapist in training to interact with the environment when there were certain challenges. So I'm hoping that answers your question. So I think it is plausible and possible, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Des.
Just before you go, Simone, got a question for you too, for your chocolate.
Can I ask, phone a friend?
Tension between edutainment and education.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility of unintended digression, if you can put it that way?
I think there's always going to be tensions and contestations. If we look at, for example, she's left now, Prof. Hardman speaks about this in activity theory. There are always going to be these tensions and contestations within the space. And I think it's linked to, again, this issue of context, and it's linked to this issue of the digital divide. And the fact that the future of higher education is a contested space at the moment. So I think in terms of edutainment, we shouldn't be making it. We should be making it entertaining and edutaining, but not to an extent where it's gimmicky. There needs to be a very particular learning style learning theory that is embedded in the practice when you are designing these learning spaces.
Powerful tools, eh? Thank you, Simone.
You're welcome.
And there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will, thank you. I'm going to take this. Thank you.
When I was a matric marker, one of our senior markers left me with a real gem. He said, Barry, when you guys are marking, when you mark that last script, you mark it with the same intensity and the same passion as you did the first one. Now, why am I saying that? Because we have our last speaker now, né? So there's no rush for any lunch or anything. And I think with the same passion and tension that we paid with the other speakers, we also give to our last speaker. That's before Prof. Livingston summarizes everything. So Prof. Wahid is an associate professor at the Faculty of Education at CPUT. He's co-author of 4 books: Educational Technology and Pedagogic Encounters, Democratic Education in Potentiality in 2016. Also, Rupturing African Philosophy of Teaching and Learning, Ubuntu Justice and Education, that was in 2018. Also, Cosmopolitan Education and Inclusion, The Self and Others in Deliberation in 2020, and Conversations on Higher Teaching and Learning, a renewed focus on critical praxis. Prof. Wahid, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thank you for taking the time to attend the seminar. I'm quite privileged to have most of you because we all have a role in higher education, irrespective of which department we are in, faculty, and so forth. So I'm quite excited to present this topic concerning the whole idea of global citizenship education, but linking it to the idea of looking beyond the post-COVID-19 context towards looking at specifically where we are moving. So as the previous presenters mentioned, we don't have the answer, but the idea is to cultivate collaborative thinking so that we think more deeper in terms of this contentious topic. So this was a study that was conducted amongst university lecturers concerning global citizenship education. Now I want to mention prior to just this slide, I was just speaking to someone earlier, and then she got confused about who I am. I'm not sure if that's linked to the fact that I've grown a bit older since 2020. But I think that in the last 2 years, I think the pandemic has definitely had a significant impact on us in terms of how we communicate with others, in terms of the platforms that we use. We become so consumed about the technology that we don't even realize the person that's actually sitting next to us. So it will be quite interesting to see, because I haven't been in a physical classroom since 2020 March, and that's a very long time ago. So I hope that when I do go back, I will know how to teach, and I hope that my students will know how to interact with me. Now, I started in 2015 in the Faculty of Education, and I came from, as most of you have emanated from, a school context. So I was a school teacher not too long ago, and I had this expectation of my students when I transitioned into higher education, and my expectation was linked to the fact that when I was a university student, what I realized was that one would be forthcoming to engage with one's university lecturer, but then I realized that wasn't always the case, even in the context that I found myself in. So I had certain expectations, and when I started out at CPUT, I remember entering the class, and then when I entered the class, it was that traditional style where you stand in front of a desk, like it's happening now, and then you have the students there, and the expectation is that they would learn from you. So in terms of my own experiences, I recall asking my students this question: how do you see yourself as a global citizen? And I recall most students were unable to answer that question. What does it mean to be a global citizen? And I'm not sure if it's linked to the fact that the students didn't understand the question, or that they were not really able to think beyond even their local context. And as a result, I needed to look at how I could disrupt that barrier as me, as a university educator, having this power relation over my students, and I needed to contest it towards ensuring that there was more equitable discussion, so that there's a greater sense of inclusivity in my classroom context. So this is your traditional layout at our campus in Mowbray, and most colleagues know this specific setting. And again, in terms of how students are situated, it's quite important to look at the environment in terms of, sorry, I got distracted by that boat there. It's quite important to disrupt the environment in terms of how we engage with our students. And I've implemented several pedagogical approaches. So a lot of my teaching is very much attuned by Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy as a means of disrupting the banking concept. So, in terms of my experience as an educator, as I mentioned, there was this disconnectedness with my students. And I needed to look at how I could situate myself in their shoes as a means of understanding more deeper their emotions, their personalities, their abilities to learn effectively on their own, but also as part of a community. I did feel that because of the sense of isolation, I was also alienated from my students. So as a result of this, I needed to look again at looking how I could use technology to support my teaching and learning practices. And as we know, technology is not the panacea towards addressing the issues that we have in society, but it does have a profound role in terms of shaping our perspectives and shaping us as individuals. So the whole notion of isolated silos was very much prevalent in my specific context. Now, I also remember during 2015, we went through over the last few years, we've gone through several crises. And in 2015, we had the Fees Must Fall protest, not long ago, it happened, calling for the decolonization of the university curriculum. What did that actually mean? What does it mean when you're decolonizing a curriculum? Does it mean that you are totally eradicating the knowledge from the West or European context in relation to the African context? So I needed to explore ways in which I could understand what that actually meant. So as in academics, we were under a lot of pressure in terms of coming up with pragmatic, plausible solutions towards addressing this specific issue. Now, to me, there's different notions in terms of what decolonization in education practice even means. For one, to me, decolonizing our practices means that we are disrupting the status quo in terms of how we teach and how learners expect to learn. So that whole idea of disrupting the power relations is very much linked to that idea of decolonizing our teaching and learning practices. So we went through a shutdown, and then we also went recently through a lockdown. And I think, when I think of lockdown, I think of us as prisoners in a specific environment. And when I think of shutdown, I think of some factory being shut down to ensure that it cannot continue further. But as academics, we don't see universities, schools, colleges as factories, because that would essentially perpetuate the notion that students need to receive, that they need to be filled in with a lot of information and so forth. So what have we learned from the crises in higher education? Firstly, we cannot be complacent. And here I'm referring to the fact that when the pandemic hit, many of us were, I won't say running around like headless chickens, but to a large extent that could perhaps be the reason, or we can link that to that. But in terms of complacency, the whole idea of constantly upskilling and reskilling our competencies is quite significant, especially with regards to dealing with a specific crisis. The other aspect that we also need to take into account is that we need to always expect the unexpected. We don't know what the next crisis, when it will happen and how it will unfold. But the whole idea, again, of ensuring that we are prepared is quite significant for higher education. What is also important is to make do with what we have, and realizing that our students don't always have access to the technology, but coming up with ways in which our students are more inclusive as part of our practices. Now, the World Economic Forum is very descriptive around the 21st century skills. And these are merely 4 of the core competencies that students ought to develop in order to ensure that they are able to address complex challenges, critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. Nothing really new. Most of us know about these core competencies. But what does it mean in terms of transitioning effectively in the current context and transitioning towards the next industrial revolution, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh industrial revolution? Does it mean that we should focus specifically on these skills? Or does it mean that we need to look at how we can prepare and reimagine some of these skills in a specific context? So I linked these skills quite prominently to the whole idea of global citizenship education. And I do believe that it is significant, especially with regards to discussions around decolonizing the higher education curricula in South Africa, towards developing the capacities of our students so that they are able to critically scrutinize the economic, the social, the political inequities that continue to perpetuate this neoliberal agenda, which is very much apparent in our specific context. Now, the integration of global citizenship education into the education systems of many nations, including South Africa, remains rather elusive. Now, as I mentioned, technology, although how powerful it is, it's not the panacea, but it can redefine, it can modify how people interact in specific contexts. Now, in my teaching and learning practices, I focus quite extensively in terms of how do I cultivate a community amongst my students? How do I ensure that the way I teach in an online sphere is a means towards ensuring that my students come to speech, that they are able to co-construct knowledge with me, that they are able to deliberate with me. And that's not always the case. It's easy to say students should be able to do those things, but the reality is perhaps due to the fact that students are so accustomed to a face-to-face context that they are not always even really prepared for an online sphere could be is perhaps a significant barrier in terms of this whole idea of inclusivity. Now, Andriotti and Pashpi presents individual cases from the global north, which involves practices around GCE through the use of technologies, where they have looked at the efficacy in terms of integrating it and using technology to support it. But there's a scarcity of empirical research, especially in a South African or global South context with regards to the use of technology. So the aim of this research was to investigate the underpinnings guiding university educators, their pedagogical practices at the South African University in developing their students' critical capacities for critical GCE. Now, I used the work of Vanessa Andriotti, and she developed what is known as a soft versus critical GCE framework, which was used as the conceptual lens to investigate the approaches by the educators. But I will move into that shortly. Now, in the Faculty of Education, do I have 5 minutes? Oh my goodness. Now, in the Faculty of Education, we have the minimum requirements for teacher education qualification policy, and it focuses quite extensively on the types of learning practices. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've still got 5 minutes now, but what I rather want to focus on is the framework itself. Now, the framework, I conceptualized in line with the original framework that was developed by Vanessa Andriotti. And she speaks firstly, or I identified rather, as the problem. So when you talk about a soft approach to GCE, then you identify the fact that, let's say, students are not adept at using educational technology. They're not, because the fact that they might not have the skills, they might not have the competencies and so forth. But a critical GCE perspective would argue that the system that is in place continues to undermine and continues to exploit those who have and those who do not have. So that's the problem. When we look at an ethics of care, we look at from a soft approach, we look at the interconnected relationship that exists between students and university educators. The whole idea of ensuring that there's a harmonious relationship. But a critical GCE perspective would argue that as individuals, yes, we are part of a community, but as educators, I have an obligation towards my students and not for my students, because the moment you have an obligation for students, then you treat them as recipients of knowledge. So that's an ethics of care. Then we also look at the whole idea of transformative change. What does transformation mean in a social sphere, social GCE, and what does it actually mean in terms of a critical GCE? So when we look at transformative change, we also need to take into account that from a critical GCE perspective, the whole idea is to ensure that, again, the inequities are disrupted, that the social injustices are transformed from a negative to a positive as a means, again, of ensuring that there's a greater sense of equity and equality within the specific context. When we look at the degree of empowerment, we also look at the fact that conditions needs to be put in place to ensure that those students in our classroom context are empowered by ensuring, again, that they have voices in their specific context. So the degree of empowerment is quite profound in terms of a soft versus a critical GCE perspective. So in terms of, again, even the notion of empowerment, if you're looking at it from a critical GCE perspective, then we need to look at how we can use technology as a means of cultivating a community. Then we also look at the degree of conflict. Sorry, I'm rushing a bit here. But in terms of the degree of conflict with GCE, there's also certain issues. So for instance, if you're looking at it from a soft perspective, then the problem is that a soft GCE may result in students feeling alienated. It may result in cultural supremacy over others, whereas a critical GCE approach, a potential conflict, is also due to the fact that, sorry, I've now lost my thought because I'm rushing for time here. Actually, can I move on rather? I don't want to, all right. Okay, so, yeah, I'm sorry about I'm rushing, but anyways, I know I've got 5 minutes left, less than 5, sorry. Methodology, I'm not going to speak about this, but perhaps some of the key findings in terms of the study itself is what I'll talk about briefly. So what I found out is that GCE is not adequately integrated in the education curricula. Majority of the lecturers had a rudimentary understanding of what GCE actually is, and the responses were mainly linked to a soft approach to global citizenship education. Now, quite interesting enough, despite the challenges faced by many of the university lecturers in terms of implementing hybrid teaching and learning, and originally emergency remote teaching and learning, and then eventually remote teaching and learning, the technology was still able, or the pedagogical practices used by the lecturers, they were still able to develop a sense of autonomy, a critical thinking, and also a community of practice amongst the students. They were also aware that students might have the sense of internal conflict in that regard. So just some of the comments presented. In terms of the framework that I used, some of the lecturers indicated that there was this sense of isolated micro-communities within their specific contexts. And in terms of the technology, certain lecturers acknowledged that it was not feasible to teach with technology in the classroom, and majority also believe that their students are, and however, majority of the lecturers believe that their students are more independent, while some students are not dependent. The nature of the discourse has essentially remained the same in terms of the teaching and learning practices, and although the technology has been used to advance teaching and learning practices, even prior to the pandemic and post-pandemic, the idea of ensuring that students' identities has always been quite significant. In terms of internal conflict, a soft approach to GCE was realized, in the sense that students felt being alienated from other groups or internally holding a degree of cultural supremacy. Students also struggled and appeared to challenge, to embrace the concept of Africanacity. From a critical approach to GCE, the whole idea of focusing on global thinking was very much missing from the students' understanding in terms of how they saw themselves, because the reality was that most of the students were focusing more on what happens in their own community and blaming the government and blaming their own conditions without really thinking, what can I do as an individual and transition beyond these issues that I have in my context. Okay, so in summary, GCE curriculum holds the possibility for aspiring teachers to instill in their future classrooms the idea of preparing them for the specific context. It also expects university lecturers to assume a degree of responsibility towards their students by allowing students to question even the type of educational technology that is used in the classroom. How often are we in that position where we allow our students to ask us to use a specific technology and critique whether our technology is actually to the benefit of them as students? Now, because of rushing through the framework, I didn't actually speak about the essence even of service learning. So if you look at the notion of service learning, we use certain projects and we send our students to communities to resolve a specific issue. But when you're looking at it from a critical service learning perspective, then it's a means towards inviting the community, being part of developing these service learning initiatives as a means of ensuring that they are part and parcel of the curriculum and not seen as isolated, that we must do something for them. Acknowledging the existence of any form of internal conflict is a step forward in terms of moving beyond. And I think the whole idea of acknowledging that there is internal conflict is a means to ensuring that students are able to progress further, that once their levels of comfort is disrupted, they're able to think more deeper. But I do feel that there needs to be a supportive environment for rethinking and recreating the identity. So just in short, just some final questions for you as the audience. What needs to change? Okay? What is the problem that we need to address? Is it only due to the fact that students don't have the technology, or are there other underlying issues that also need to perhaps be scrutinized? We don't really know whether it's in the culture of students to want to adopt perhaps other pedagogical practices. We don't really know that. So that's what we need to also take into account. Who needs to enact this change? Is it only us as university educators? Is it the government? Or is it the government, schools, university lecturers, and students? So Klaus Schwab speaks quite prominently about systems thinking of including all role players and not just blaming the government and so forth. And why do we need to change? The need to change is also linked to the idea of ensuring that there's some form of internal and external transformation. And where will this change take place? Will it happen in our own micro communities, or will it actually happen outside in our local context and even global context? And when will it take place? I suppose that very much depends on us willing to transition. All right, that is it. I'm sorry that I rushed a bit with the framework, but thank you.
Thank you, Zaid. Yeah, he pulled us a fast one. He asked the questions before we could get hold of him. Yeah. Are there any questions that we could pose? And I'm sure there are quite a few. I do not want to use my position and fire away. Right, Sam is there.
Thanks so much, Zaid. Just going to when we speak about 21st century skills that we need to have, when you spoke about critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration, could you maybe tell us what tools you would use to ensure that these 4 skills are utilized within the online space?
Okay. I wouldn't necessarily focus too much on the actual tools. What I would focus on first is establishing a relationship with the students. So perhaps a tool that you could use is a social networking platform. So in the past, I have used Facebook and WhatsApp as social networking platforms. And I found that, that a social networking platform is much more developmental in terms of students actually coming to speech. Because the platform itself, the learning management system that we use, for instance, at our institution, is very much linked to an assessment practice. Students realize that the moment I'm part of an LMS, I know it's linked to an assessment. But I've realized that students are much more forthcoming to engage with you when they are using a social networking platform. But at the same time, again, when you are using that specific platform, you need to take into account the whole idea of cultivating the community, social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. So how do you build a social presence with your students first so that they are able to come to speech, so that they're able to even correct each other, and that they acknowledge that they need to correct each other, and that they are willing to be corrected, while at the same time ensuring that they are able to understand more deeper in terms of what they are actually being presented. So a tool in that regard could perhaps be a platform that you could possibly use, but to me what is first important is to look at that community.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. I think to answer, your question, just I want to use like one example that, currently you are busy in our field. I realized that, for example, in EU, all of us, that per decade they develop a sort of, very interesting projects in various aspects, such as Horizon Europe is one of them. And through that, project, there are many, categories of science. For example, one of the interesting ones that I somehow am involved is circular economy, that towards solving some global issues such as climate change or massive amount of waste, for example. So my understanding is that to reach to that level, maybe at government level or at the nation or at Africa continent, for example, where we are going actually, what are our issues? I see that, for example, in that project, one that now recently we are involved, we are like selected from DSI as a university to be partner with 12 other institutions, universities, organizations, companies, to solve one specific problem. This is my question. So do we have such a plan in, let's say, South Africa? What you are trying to solve in our institution? I see that there is no linkage.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So how we can reach to that level, how we can influence the, politicians or government to reach to that level? What are those challenges of South Africa at the moment? Should we solve, for example, CO2 emission, or maybe we have other issues? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question in terms of how do we actually, what we do in our specific practice, how do we actually inform, for instance, the government, businesses, and so forth. And to a large extent, it's quite challenging because what we present in our specific research is not always presented to the wider audience. So what we need to do is we need to look at how we can make ourselves more known to the broader public. Because once we become more known to the broader public, then we are able to share our insights, we are able to share our perspectives, and so forth. And I think that could perhaps be seen as a platform. Like, for instance, what we're doing now, we are having a seminar, and the seminar is seen as a platform to which we are able to engage, we are able to discuss, and the presentation itself is being shown on YouTube. And we don't know where this will eventually lead to. So even if it happens at a micro level, the hope is that it would lead up to the next level, so that governments are able to buy into the idea, okay, this is what we should be focusing on, and this is how we can go about doing that. But that requires, again, a collaborative effort on the part of both parties as a means of ensuring that we are able to address the problem as a whole. Yes, yes, hopefully. Thank you.
Zaid, not to jump and, as they say, to pluck on stamps, but I agree with you there. The first thing I noticed about the program was the diversity of the speakers and where they come from. And there was some degree of stepping away from a particular institutional loyalty and addressing the issue at hand, which doesn't often come naturally in higher education. The last speaker, Moses, you got a question?
Oh, thank you very much. It's a question and a comment. I'm from Omobri campus, SP, FET. I teach computers in education. I'm been teaching teachers how to use ICTs in teaching and learning since 1998. It's a long time ago. I will speak from the three perspectives: from an end user point of view, from an educator point of view, from a software engineer point of view.
It'll have to be a quick question, Moses.
I wanted to just look at the 21st century skills. Yes, I understand. It depends on what you are talking about when you're talking about critical thinking or creativity, communication and collaboration. Our main challenge, like what you have said, is that most of the research in ICTs in education, most of the work which has been done has not yet found consumers. And that's what we are saying. How are we going to make that? And as educators, in most cases, most of our lecturers and most of the students, how are we going to overcome the barriers, the macro barriers and the micro barriers? Those barriers are still there. Remember, education does not produce any technology. We are consumers, and most of the things which we are relying on may not be making our students any good. They could be making them even more unintelligible. And as researchers, how are we going to bridge the gap between macro barriers and micro barriers?
That sounds like a question.
Right, thank you for that question, Dr. Moyo. I think it very much depends again on the, my student would know, and I'm glad he's here, the capabilities of the context. So when we talk about capabilities, we talk about the freedoms that individuals would appreciate in their specific context. So I'm thinking now in terms of your question, and I'm linking it, trying to link it up to the seminal thoughts of Amartya Sen, who has written quite extensively on the capability approach and looked specifically at the influence of the economic freedoms, the social freedoms, transparency guarantees, and even political freedoms. And in terms of addressing those barriers, I do believe first that it needs to happen at a macro level before we can start looking at the issues that are impacting on them. It's not always possible for a university lecturer to teach and address the digital divide without that support system in place. And once those freedoms are enhanced, then we can start talking about ensuring that students are able to learn more effectively and more efficaciously in their specific context. So I would look specifically first at the unfreedoms, and then we start looking at re-examining the curricula, because even the curricula itself, and some of the presenters previously mentioned CRAPS, the curriculum itself does not really adequately prepare students for the university context. And that requires a lot of attention on the part of university educators in having to prepare them and to ensure that they are adequately prepared for a university context. And perhaps that is also linked to the fact that the discussions aren't really happening between higher education and the school context. So what we do in a higher education context, our expectation is that students would be prepared for industry, or they would be prepared, like for us as university educators, teacher educators, for the school context. But the reality is that that is not always the case. So discussions also need to happen, and we need to look at how we can ensure that our curriculum is opposite towards preparing and developing the skill set of students so that they are able to be better prepared for the next, as I mentioned, the next industrial revolution and so forth.
Zaid, just before you step away and before Candace comes up, who pays the piper picks the tune? Just as you're leaving, so maybe you'll just... Who's picking the tune here? Or who's paying the piper?
I suppose perhaps you can rephrase your question.
So, I think we're all struggling to find out who's actually in control here of the rhythms that are coming to our shores.
Okay.
And we're all responding to these distant influences. And somewhere in the line, the question is then, so, now wie se paper dance ons? To whose and what are we chasing?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we function in a neoliberal context. And our policies, our economic policies, our education policies are informed by this whole idea of neoliberalism. And what we teach to our students is very much linked to the fact that what has been dictated onto us as university educators by outside parties, outside of the, for instance, our African context, the local government. So if we look at our economic policies, our national development plan, for instance, focuses on ensuring that a certain number of PhD graduates needs to happen at a specific period of time. So who dictates that? And when we're looking at PhD graduates in our specific context, will that actually result in the economic development that is very much needed in our specific context? Or do we need to focus more on other aspects outside of what is dictated to us? And that doesn't always really happen in our specific context. Students feel that once they have acquired a university qualification, that they would automatically receive work. And who puts that in their minds? The curriculum? Is it society? Is it the government? I think the whole idea of neoliberalism very much comes into play in that regard again.
Thanks, Zaid. Candace, you've got the unenviable task of making sense of today's talks for us.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to read my speech so that I don't make the mistake of having the unenviable task of leaving someone out. Okay, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for attending the Faculty of Education Teaching and Learning seminar entitled Teaching and Learning in Higher Education Post-COVID, Where Are We Going? I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the presenters whose papers that were presented today have certainly given us pause for thought. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused an abrupt and profound change in the world. It is the worst shock to the education system in decades and has caused the longest school closures combined with looming recessions. It has set back progress made on global development goals, particularly those focused on education. And all of this has led to a crisis in human development that continues long after the disease transmission has ended. It is fair to say that the education system has experienced a seismic upheaval during the past 3 years. In 2020, Engelbrecht et al. Actually even called it, although it was tongue-in-cheek, a turn to panic-gogy. Research conducted by Diana Moodley in 2021 notes that the pivot to online learning in higher education in South Africa has led to teaching and learning that has regressed into impersonal methodologies devoid of any notion of pedagogy as a science, and we have lost the art of teaching. More unsettling is that students have become alienated and disengaged from learning as a collaborative process. This increased transactional distance between students and academics has desensitized the latter to the peculiar challenges students encounter in the virtual classroom. In this post-COVID reality, we find ourselves acknowledging the need for online learning that is meaningful and not panicked. We need to acknowledge that pandemic pedagogy has been rooted in deep inequalities and that students from disadvantaged backgrounds have paid the price. The impact on students centered on isolation and disconnectedness and the need for emergent technologies and alternate pedagogies that center the student have been recognized. Ivan Illich, in his book entitled Deschooling Society, observes that learning is the result of unhampered participation in meaningful settings, and that we need to consider what those meaningful settings should look like in these troubled times. Instead of requiring students to gaze at computers for hours, we should orientate cross-disciplinary instruction that presses our students on the moral, ethical, and environmental consequences of their work. The presentations today have spoken to this reality and offer some insights, some interesting insights and hope based on research and personal reflections. I cannot do justice to any of the presentations, but I can try and capture the essence of each. Professor Hardman introduced us to the Teach, Assess, Teach pedagogical model, which is underpinned by cultural historical theory. In this model, students must be able to establish distance between themselves and the task, be able to argue logically and provide evidence, follow rules for arriving at an answer, and appreciate what constitutes a good answer. And this pedagogical model incorporates assessment into the teaching. Based on Vygotskian principles, where co-creation of meaning is done at the student's pace, but using valid knowledge with epistemic weight, it shows us that explanatory talk that starts with authentic real-life problems being taught, which are then assessed so that the unknown can be taught, has led to increased interaction with students and creating content that is more accessible. Dr. Stradham's presentation challenges us to consider a socio- or new materials perspective in which we consider all the multifaceted dimensions in higher education, teaching and learning. New materialism places emphasis on the heightened status of materials, where material has been the silent partner for all too long, and she focuses specifically on the three types of entanglements that are necessary. That's the expectations of the institution, the lecturers and the students, the past, current, and future teaching and learning practices, and epistemic access, which is granted to and by the institution to the learners and students. Meaning making is interconnected, and the potential agentic impact that materials could have needs to be acknowledged, together with the role of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the potential of inclusivity of digital technology. Professor Titus's presentation on emergent technologies of virtual reality and augmented reality in medical education highlighted the potential that these technologies have to change the way that students engage and interact with learning materials. These technologies increase student engagement, interactivity, as well as enjoyment, and students acquire skills and a vast array of knowledge as there's an integration of the digital with the physical world. Her research has highlighted that VR and AR has led to active student participation and helped students feel like they are in the classroom in a practicing environment. They are allowed to work in disciplinary teams and work with people from all over the world. Her research shows that it is time to make changes to the strategic positioning of the curricula in health sciences to allow for students to develop the capacity to function as 21st century digital citizens, and for lecturers to engage in compassionate learning designs. Thus, there is an urgent need for higher education institutions to respond to some of these initiatives to effect positive social change with higher education and health science education sectors. This idea of compassionate learning is linked with Professor Wachid's notions of a soft approach to global citizen education and an ethics of care. While the world may be increasingly interconnected, human rights violations, inequality, and poverty still threaten peace and sustainability. Global Citizen Education, GCE, is UNESCO's response to these challenges, and it works to empowering learners of all ages to understand that these are global and not local issues, and to become active promoters of more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, and secure and sustainable society. Prof. Wachid notes that studies on GCEs still center on the global north perspective and that there is a lack of research in the global south. His research highlights the fact that GCE is not adequately integrated in teacher education curricula and that the majority of lecturers in his study have a rudimentary understanding of this approach. His research also found that despite the challenges of using technology in the classroom, it appeared to foster a level of critical thinking, autonomy, and a community of practice again amongst pre-service teachers. And he concludes that a GCE approach expects university lecturers to assume a degree of responsibility towards their students, that acknowledging the existence of any form of internal conflict is a step towards a supportive environment for transformation and for rethinking and recreating student identity within the confines of an ethics of care approach. What is clear from the work presented here today is that lecturers using post-pandemic pedagogies are working towards what Elizabeth Jones calls spaces of belonging, where belonging is viewed as social cultural connections that create ties to educational spaces. Barotas and Mills have characterized three elements that relate to belonging as relational, material, and pedagogical spaces. These spaces are associated with practices in education that are based on choice, shared respect, and support. And these spaces intersect to form the educational space, which enables and conversely disables belonging, engagement, and connectedness within the setting. Fatah and Nuruddin Fatah note that although digital technology is not the silver bullet for rescuing education in post-COVID times, its centrality in teaching and learning cannot be discounted, nor can negative experiences with online technology cloud the debates about its appropriation. Hesitation about engaging with the affordances of digital education should also be avoided. This was the purpose of today's seminar, to engage with technological affordances and lessons learned during the pandemic, and to forge ahead with conversations and research so that, as Fatah et al. Note, epistemic inequalities are not perpetrated by favoring traditional learning regimes. I would like to end with a passage from an article entitled "Pandemic is a Portal," which was written in April of 2020 by the author Arundhati Roy, right at the beginning of the pandemic, where she recognized that we have been given a very unique opportunity here. She writes, "Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to the past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced human beings to break with the past and imagine their world anew, and this one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and our dead ideas, and our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. I was so glad that you mentioned Ivan Illich. And I thought, what are we worried about? Wouldn't that be a glorious world? Think of all the kids, the children that would not suffer all the harm that they do in schooling at the moment. And I use the word schooling. So, Zaid, I'm going to ask you to come up and do the thanks.
Right, so that brings us to the end of the seminar. Firstly, I would like to thank all of you for attending the seminar. It could not have been possible without your presence. So I think we can give ourselves a round of applause for that. Thank you to Professor Huyswemmer for her opening remarks in terms of CPUT's Vision 2030 and how the seminar essentially aligns with the university's vision concerning hybrid teaching and learning. Thank you to the presenters from Professor Hardman of UCT, Dr. Strydom from Stellenbosch University, Professor Titus from UWC, and also Professor Livingston from CPUT. Thank you for your presentations and for the summary as well with regards to each of the presenters' talks. I think the talks were quite informative. They sparked discussions. They invited key insights in terms of where we should be moving. I remember I was having this discussion earlier with Barry with regards to the topics. Where are we going versus who's forcing us to be here? Where have we gone? Where are we being, sorry, where are we being taken? Thank you for that. Thank you also to Barry for serving as the program organizer. I could not think of anyone else who would not have done such an excellent job as you, so thank you very much. Thank you also to the Faculty of Education for the support with regards to allowing us to have the seminar, yes, and seminar at this the venue. And thank you also to the organizer of the venue. I think that they've done an outstanding job, and I look forward to the lunch that will be served very shortly. And in terms of one of the members mentioned about having a seminar next year and inviting government officials. I think that's definitely something that we would look at in the near future. So hopefully next year we will have again a seminar, and hopefully it will be here again for 2023. All right, thank you, and enjoy your lunch. And I will also send an email out to everyone with regards to the presentations. I should also have mentioned that I was the person emailing everyone. So if you so you can put the face now. All right, thank you again, colleagues, and enjoy lunch.
Thank you.